in the wake of the assassination of Charlie Kirk on a college campus in Utah. Now, this is a man that many saw as a free speech hero, while others saw as a provocateur. I feel compelled to examine the direction of travel of speech and expression here in Canada. But expression is a mechanism by which we think, that we grow, and we build a society that values the principles of liberty. Principles that increasingly seem like they're of a past era. What does it mean when a sizable number of university students engage in self-censorship if they feel that their opinions aren't welcome? And that's often based on their perceived position in the intersectional identity hierarchy. Do faculty play a role in the chill of expression? We know that university faculties and administrators are overwhelmingly left-leaning, and that universities often have diversity, equity, and inclusion policies that marginalize the majority. Today, I want to talk about the continuing cultural shift that punishes often non-progressive views and reward conformity. I'm joined by David Hunt, Research Director at the Aristotle Foundation, and Martin Mrazik, Professor of Educational Psychology at the University of Alberta. Their new study with the Aristotle Foundation paints a sobering picture of Canadian campuses, where increasingly, even middle-of-the-road milquetoast opinions are seen as too controversial to voice. I'm Melanie Bennett. This is Disrupted. So first of all, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
But before we get into the details, I want to start by talking about what might be a bit of an elephant in the room, and that's the assassination of Charlie Kirk. This happened obviously very recently. It's important because he was shot on a college campus in America whilst he was engaging in debating often controversial topics on campus and helping students and people in general disagree better or discuss difficult topics. And there's been a bit of a backlash, depending on your point of view, what that backlash might look like. Now, after his death, many people took to social media to mourn his death, calling him perhaps a hero for free speech. But many other people took to social media to say, maybe he shouldn't have died, but actually he had abhorrent views and there are consequences for speech. Possibly one of the more famous one at the minute is Dr. Ruth Marshall from the University of Toronto, who said that shooting is honestly too good for many fascists, expletive. And these people who, some might say celebrated his death, others might say criticized Charlie Kirk. Many people have been placed on leave, engaging in some cancellations, you might say, over this particular instance. So I think this is really relevant, and I'd really like to know how you feel this might affect speech on Canadian campuses. And I don't know who would like to start, perhaps Marty?
Sure, yeah, obviously our hearts go out to the family of Charlie Kirk. The impact this is having, I think it really is opening people's eyes to what it is going on campuses and why there would be such a strong reaction to somebody who really came to campuses to create discussion, to create debate. I know sometimes people found what he said and his opinions to be offensive, and yet he was quite respectful. If you look at his many online interactions, he was engaging with students. And so when we think of, well, why is this strong reaction? I think the question, the concern is, well, why are students so adverse to critical thinking, to debate, to discussions like that? What is going on in a classroom setting that students just react this strongly? And sometimes there's been a lot of violence, not just with Charlie Kirk, but Ben Shapiro and other individuals who have been on campuses, and we've seen very strong social reactions to that. And so this highlights, well, what is going on campuses that people are reacting in this way? I mean, post-secondary institutions are supposed to be about critical thinking and debate and discussion and coming to higher ideals. That is what our goal is. And yet we're seeing, instead of more of that, we're seeing, well, we have to shut people down. And I think that's the question, and that's the concern, is what is going on campuses that these type of trends are happening.
David?
Yeah, who I would point people to is Bernie Sanders, the statement he released was I think the best summary of kind of where we're at, how important freedom is, democracy is. And Bernie Sanders, of course, wasn't aligned with Charlie Kirk on pretty much anything. But the one thing they held in common is we have to have open dialogue. We have to be able to debate. And most especially, and of course, Bernie Sanders didn't go here, but where we'll go with this is at and on a university campus and in the classroom. If we're going to learn, we have to be able to think out loud, which means to be able to challenge each other in obviously a respectful way. But I have to be able to ask hard questions if I'm going to be able to understand a subject or a position. If I'm really to understand your views on something, I need to be able to articulate that. And so how are we to learn? So just from the university context, how are we to learn unless we can process out loud and debate and dialogue with each other? So the assassination of Charlie Kirk, it's more than alarming. It's and again, as our study shows, just the state of universities, it's remarkably unhealthy, and showing how remarkably unhealthy our society is. So how important this is that we do respond in an appropriate fashion, and hopefully this assassination will lead to a resolve to prioritize freedom, to prioritize dialogue, to prioritize healthy, open debate. And I'm optimistic that there will be bipartisan leaning in that direction, and that people will start to wake up and say enough is enough. We need to get back to basics.
Well, right now on campuses in Canada, we don't really have... So Charlie Kirk founded Turning Point. Turning Point, the whole purpose is to go around campuses and discuss topics. We don't have that in Canada, really. I think there's some people attempting to do that right now, but we don't really have that here. We don't have anything else that like that. And there's been certainly a lot of incidents on many campuses of canceling certain controversial speakers. So what we're seeing, according to the data that you've put out, is that a sizable number of Canadian university students are hiding the way that they truly feel about certain opinions, particularly controversial opinions, because they fear like they might be sanctioned, they might be mistreated or discriminated against based on those opinions. So maybe now is the time to go into that data. On overview, let's start with Martin. What's the biggest takeaway message from the study?
Well, I think some of the biggest takeaway messages is that a majority of students feel very uncomfortable expressing their viewpoints on controversial subjects in a classroom setting. And we certainly understand that on any individual level, some people just are shy or they don't want to express themselves. But when we see the significant numbers that we saw consistently across different universities, and the other significant finding was even individuals who align with moderate political views, moderate to more conservative views, they felt less and less able to express their viewpoints. And so it really suggests that there's a strong leaning in a classroom setting that if you align with certain values that you feel comfortable to express yourself, but if you don't, you're really worried about being canceled. You're really worried that your viewpoints are going to be looked at in a very strong negative way. And so students are silent. Students aren't saying things. And if you can imagine your son or daughter going to university, paying university tuition, and feeling that they can't say anything, feeling like they are shut down. And anytime we see people shut down, it really interferes with the whole collaborative process. It really interferes with critical thinking. It's really important in a university setting that you exchange ideas. And sometimes it's an uncomfortable process. But I'll refer back to the great quote from Jordan Peterson when he said, in order to think, you have to be willing to offend. And we need to see that in a classroom setting. And our results say that a substantive number of students are not in a position where they feel they can do that.
So let's talk about identity. That seems to be a theme that comes up in your data. So depending on a person's particular identity, whether that's sex, race, gender, so on, they might have different views on whether they can express controversial opinions. So David, maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so something that we did in the analysis of the report is we looking at the whole sample, all of the data. It was interesting that 80% of the responses could be broken down into 6 personas, where for example, Asian students or students who are white and Hispanic who vote liberal and are non-religious, or a category that may be controversial in the present moment, but white straight males who are religious. And of course, this is self-reporting. And that last category, we called them patent, and it was fascinating that on almost any topic, they're hesitant to express their views because their views aren't welcome. And the strongest category in terms of the unlikeliness to feel free to express themselves are the Jewish students. And so we looked at just the Jewish students, and on every single category, they are less likely than the average student to feel free to express what they believe. And for the Jewish students in particular, the likelihood that they feel or are mistreated every single day is substantially more than the average student. So I'd have to go back and look at the data, but something like five times more likely than the average student to be mistreated for what they believe. So in terms of a campus environment, again, you think of the learning experience. For some students, campus is a hostile environment. May sound hyperbolic, that may sound a little far, but I think the data does suggest that for some of these students, campus environment is actually a hostile environment. And there are some students who can express almost anything they want to, regardless of consequence, and don't even think twice about what they say, and perhaps are reckless with their speech. But they are ones who for lack of a better word, are part of the zeitgeist, the reigning dogma on campus, in particular your liberal students.
Yeah, we hear the term the tyranny of the minority, and I feel like we're seeing a little bit of that in that data. And you mentioned Jewish students. That Jewish individuals in Canada are not the majority. They're a minority religious group. And you do see it in your data that they are very, what we could say, disproportionately feel that they can't express themselves. And then another group is, I think it said that non-binary students felt that 87% of non-binary students felt very confident in expressing their views on controversial gender issues, even though they're a small minority, whereas 31% of males and 48% of females said that they didn't feel comfortable expressing their views. I guess you could say cis individuals, right? So using that jargon, we could say that there's some disparity in the data where the minority group feel much more confident expressing themselves for controversial views. Martin, are there other areas that you want to talk about in terms of where an identity really sort of really speaks out in the data?
Yeah, to me, the one that really speaks out is just we looked at how students identified with political viewpoints on select topics, and that's again where we saw significant differences. And to me, that's important in a classroom setting because there are some students that will speak up, that will express their viewpoints, in some cases probably very strong viewpoints, and they will go unchallenged because another group of students feels very, very restricted in their ability to express their viewpoints. And so when you have a setting like that, again, we are not seeing the critical thinking, the challenging, the coming together that should come out of a healthy debate, should leave you thinking. It should leave you with some purpose of, well, I have to refine my thoughts and so on. And to me, that's really important. And when we look at the social sciences, even in the last 15 years, the number of faculty that are more aligned with left-wing thinking versus the number of faculty that are aligned with more right-wing conservative values, that ratio is continuing to just completely be misaligned with what is representative, for example, in Alberta. And so, again, when we think of, we just want to make sure that there's a reasonable representative of different individuals in a classroom setting, well, we're not seeing that. We're seeing a skewing of things. And to me, in my opinion, that's where universities need to take a good look at themselves and say, what are we doing and how can we improve the experience of students, all students, on a campus setting?
Yeah, and to jump in on that, Melanie, sorry if I may, in terms of an often overlooked category is religion. And what's extraordinary is 2/3 of students self-identify as religious in some way, shape, or form. So for every one non-religious, secular, agnostic, atheist student, there's one who's religious. But what's extraordinary, to your earlier point, Melanie, the ones who feel free to express their views on religion are the atheists and agnostics and secularists. Those who are religious don't feel at liberty to be honest about what they believe. And in terms of, again, mistreatment, not a single atheist or agnostic participant in our study reported daily mistreatment for what they believe when it comes to religion. Whereas, again, we go back to the Jewish students. 15% of the Jewish students every single day experience some form of mistreatment because they're Jewish. And although that's the most extreme outlier, it's not too different for other religious students as well.
Yeah, Martin, you touched on the faculty, and I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to also talk about that. MacDonald-Laurier came out with a study looking at the faculty and their views on speech. And we're seeing that the faculty is overwhelmingly left-leaning, and then you have a small portion of faculty on the right who feel that they can't express their views. But the faculty themselves are largely left-leaning across the country. But in your data, we're seeing that students are quite conservative, right? They have a lot of students with conservative views. And so there's a skew between the faculty and the students. And I'd be curious if you have any thoughts on whether this restriction of speech is coming from the faculty or whether it's students themselves that feel like that is a thing that should be done. They believe that you should censor your speech on controversial topics.
Yeah, I'm sure there's many variables that are associated with that. The overwhelming number and ratio of faculty on campuses could sure play into that. Again, our study didn't look at, what is actually going on. So we didn't look at, disciplinary actions and so on in a classroom setting. But again, when we think of a student who probably comes into the classroom with more conservative values to start with, right? And then the faculty are expressing their viewpoints, that's going to just really limit an individual's willingness to participate. It's rare that you have somebody that feels at liberty to express their viewpoints in a first-year class unless they're feeling welcomed, unless they're feeling invited into these discussions. And to me, that would be, one of the responsibility takeaways from this is that faculties should have an understanding of how do we create a classroom setting that is inviting of all representative students. Again, like you said, we saw a sizable sample of conservative students in our population, and then this represents probably many students, and yet they are expressing viewpoints. So to your point, yes, there's many variables, but the fact that faculty are who are left-leaning are not seemingly, creating an environment that's welcoming to all viewpoints, to me is concerning.
And what I found so interesting, if you just looking at the self-reporting of students, depending on the question asked, is between 11 to 19% self-identified as politically moderate or middle of the road, something along those lines. But 11 to 19% of them were extremely concerned about what would happen to them if their political views were known. So of the moderates, these are the middle of the road students politically. Over 2/3 of them fear a lower grade if the professor knew what they actually believed politically. Almost 70% fear a formal complaint. And it was over 76%, like 77% fear repercussions on social media if their fellow students knew what they believed. These are the middle of the road moderate students. So how much more so for those who are on one side of the pole?
Yeah, that's so true because we keep hearing that it's important to include diversity. I mean, it's important to include all students and make them feel safe. And what I'm hearing from you is that actually there's a sizable proportion of students that don't feel safe. And it's not necessarily going to be the non-binary student. It's not necessarily going to be, let's say, the Asian student or the racial minority student, for example. So that's an interesting thing to see if we're able to make some headway in that over the future. But speaking of the future, do you have any suggestions for where we could go from here? Like, how do we address some of these issues?
Yeah, that's for me, I think about that a lot. I mean, one of the things that I believe could be helpful is that, as universities are ranked according to their standing, we have the McLean ranking in Canada that look at research funding, they look at teaching ratios, they look at resources for students on campus. I wonder if there couldn't be an index that's created for students, the freedom of expression index that's part of that rating. how comfortable do students feel with expressing themselves, and how do universities align with that? Because to me, that would be helpful, that they know, or that they're taking responsibility for what we're seeing on campus. I mean, that's, I know, a very big, concept to consider, and yet, okay, what are we going to actually do with what we're seeing and the data that we're seeing on campus? And that might be one way to approach the subject.
Yeah, and given that in Canada, the overwhelming majority of our universities are public institutions. So there definitely is a role for government and for the general population, for voters, to hold these institutions, albeit indirectly, but to hold them accountable. And I'm optimistic in that when you get really into the data and the granularity of it, it seems to be the case that you have what I would call the bandwagon effect, where though students who are being persecuted for their religious beliefs or gender or what have you, they are going to be more likely to lean a particular way politically in that whatever the path of least resistance is. So if only liberal views are tolerated in the class, they will self-identify that way because they can only handle so much opposition in those other categories. So if there was a change in climate politically, where you didn't have this one ideology that was dominant and you had genuine viewpoint diversity, and there were ways to help encourage that through government, et cetera, I am optimistic that you would start to see some healthy change on campus.
Yeah, that ideology is pretty well ingrained across bureaucracies and institutions and public sector and so on and so forth. And so, if we could make some headway into that, we broaden the Overton window of acceptable discourse, I think that would be very helpful. Also, an index. Is it the Fire Foundation has an index on free speech on campuses, don't they? But so we don't have anything like that in Canada. Do you see any headway in possibly being able to put that together? Is there any interest?
I think that there is interest, but there has to be the support for that. There has to be large-scale support and impetus for that. Individual efforts are great, but you really need collective efforts, and you really need it from a top-down perspective, because otherwise it'll just be seen as, kind of one-off individual attempts to make changes, as opposed to what I would consider to be important global changes.
Yeah, perhaps the unfortunate assassination of Charlie Kirk might open the window to be able to talk about the importance of speech and what happens when we vilify it so much and call people fascists for having middling, middle of the ground opinions. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today. And thank you very much. Free expression is so important in a society that values liberty. And we need your voice to keep that conversation alive. If you're a student and maybe you feel unable to express yourself at school or college or university, I'd love you to share your story in the comments. If you found this conversation valuable, I'd love you to like and maybe subscribe and share the show. For True North, I'm Melanie Bennett. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.